You are listening to the Prepared Warrior Podcast, where law enforcement and military trainers discuss cutting-edge training, tactics, and technology. Here is your host, John Wilson.
Welcome to Season 1, Episode 3 of the Prepared Warrior. I'm John Wilson. My guest for this episode is Brad Gillespie. I always like to start every episode with a quote. This is one from Albert Einstein, who said, "A person who never made a mistake never tried anything new." Our guest, Brad Gillespie, has spent 23 years policing primarily in canine and tactical support with dogs. He has trained police and military dog teams globally. He has 28 years military combined full and part-time service, infantry, and Navy diving. Brad is currently a trainer with the second largest police canine program in Canada, where he specializes in patrol, explosive detection, and tactical integration. Brad considers himself a student of the game and tries to employ science and proven-based approaches to training whenever possible. He is continually striving to better train operationally reliable canine teams through training programs that are repeatable, reliable, fundamental, teachable, and learnable. Thank you for joining us today, Brad.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I'm certainly honored and humbled to be talking to you today.
Oh, I appreciate that, yeah. So first, what experiences can you share about your background and how you became involved in working with dogs?
My background specifically in working dogs came about as a result of being a police officer in Winnipeg. And I came into it maybe with a slightly different approach. I had certainly had dogs all my life, like many of us did. But for me, going into the dog world really was, from the very beginning, not about being a dog lover, but about using dogs as a tool to help track down and find people that do bad things to other people. So for me, from the very beginning, canine work has always been about a tool, with certainly the added benefit of getting to work with dogs. So in that light, I've been extremely fortunate to spend the vast majority of my adult working life working with dog programs, either with the police or military. So I've spent a good portion of time with police programs and spent a significant number of years with military canine programs, and am now back with law enforcement, fortunately working with a bunch of great guys, and continuing on the canine front, where I work as a trainer with a fairly large program in Canada. So I've been very fortunate to spend most of my time in that regard. I've got a lot of other military experiences, but the ones I'm certainly the most proud of or most relevant to our discussion would be my canine background in that area. So I've been pretty lucky. I haven't had to go to work too many days in my adult life.
That's great. And I've heard handlers speak of their canine work as a craft. And what would you guys mean by that?
Well, I think that it's an interesting title that we give ourselves in the world, and I've certainly said those words myself, and I think it is a double-edged sword for us, and in some regards it's good. We recognize that I think typically a craft is something that needs to morph and change as we go along, and we need to develop as we go through. So seeing a craft in that light is good, where we don't necessarily see it as a specific trade or a specific way of always doing something. The negative side to viewing where canine handlers view handling as a craft, which I know I most certainly have, is that we get into apprenticeship relationships. And I think traditionally an apprentice doesn't ask a lot of questions of their teacher and instructor. We can very quickly get into, we do things because that's the way I was taught. And when somebody apprentice under me, they will do things the way that I teach them. And when we get too much into that type of mentality, of course, we can stagnate our growth in some areas and get ourselves into the fable of the monkeys on the ladder in the room, where we do a lot of things and we're not always certain why we do them. So I think there's some pros to being a craft, but I think it certainly can hinder us as well as handlers.
When you were a police handler, you and your dog worked with the SWAT team. What is the difference working with SWAT versus regular patrol?
I think there's a few differences, and not a ton, but there are certainly some. And I know for myself, working in that environment has definitely helped me. I should caveat, and I probably will throughout here, that in no way, shape, or form do I see myself as an expert, and things that I believe or think are things that I've generally learned through making mistakes, for sure. When working on certainly reduces the ability for handlers to make excuses in some cases. To be honest, in the dog world, where sometimes we can justify performance where the performance shouldn't be, where isn't at the standard that maybe it should be. And in a dog world, sometimes we all understand why maybe something happened. But when you're as one dog handler working with a tactical team, the other members of the tactical team are probably less understanding of excuses and more based on performance outcomes, and understanding that really it doesn't really matter why something happened. If it didn't happen the way it was supposed to, we need to fix it and move on. So that was a big step for me, and it's helped me having the opportunity to work with a number of agencies where I understand that really operational output and reliable and repeatable operational output is important. The other big challenge that any canine handler faces in working with a tactical team or a SWAT team, or whatever you define it as in your area of operations, is that, as a general rule, a patrol dog handler in most police agencies, when they go to a call, will be the sort of the manage a lot of that call, or be a star of the show in many cases. It's, if somebody ran and going to track them, it's the dog team that's going to try to track them down, and people are going to support the canine team. When a handler then works with a tactical team, they become an implementer or an arm of that team, and are not necessarily the dictator of their own employment methods. And sometimes that can cause a little bit of conflict, to be honest, and sometimes it just takes a little bit of getting used to and understanding different rules for different calls at different times, are all variable depending upon where you fit in that scheme. So there definitely are some differences in terms of the handler's employment on a patrol call, vice integrated or supporting a tactical team.
So can all dogs become SWAT dogs? And along with that, can all handlers become SWAT team canine handlers or tactical team handlers?
Well, again, I'm not an expert, but in my opinion, the answer generally would be no. That being said, I think it's worth the caveat that it depends on how we define the canine roles with a SWAT team or a tactical team. If we are talking about a canine team helping support a tactical team or a SWAT team with their operations, I think the scope of the number of dogs and dog teams that are going to be able to do that is much larger than when we start talking about dog teams integrated into tactical programs. So I branch those two in different directions, in terms of one being a dog that will be used intermittently for very specific tasks within a tactical team, or a dog that will track with a tactical team as backup. I believe that is different than a canine team that is integrated into a tactical team. And when we start integrating dogs into tactical teams, it certainly requires an increased level of clear-headedness for the dog, and can change the training requirements and the experience requirements for the person that's driving the dog through that. The dog handler needs to have probably an elevated level of training or experience specific to that operation. I'm not saying that training is better or worse, but they just need to understand probably at a more in-depth level where they flow and where they fit into that tactical environment.
When you say the dogs are used for different purposes, whether integrating with a team or for a specific purpose on a SWAT team or a tactical team, what do you mean by that specifically? Like, what tasks are they used for?
Well, regardless of the level of integration, dogs are used for one primary reason with any sort of tactical program, and that is as a locating tool. We certainly talk about bite work and those sorts of things get a lot of attention, but ultimately the delta that we can't close with any other tools are that the dogs are an incredible searching, hunting, and locating tool for us. Right. So the idea is, in a perfect world, is that the dog will locate threats that are threats to the team ahead of the team, and ideally with increased distance, so an increased reactionary gap. So the further ahead of the team that a canine can locate a threat, the greater number of options and time to make decisions that tactical team will do. So there is a difference in terms of the level of integration with a dog that will flow through a stack and work around a stack and understand that the dog is part of that team in a police environment, vice a dog that is potentially on a containment spot used for managing people that may flee from that, or that is sort of a tactical bound behind the stack and called up for very specific clearance. Those are all absolutely viable uses for the dog, but that increased integration level requires an increased level in training and some increased level of genetic stability for the dog himself, and as well increased training and exposure experience for the handler of the dog.
I see. Now, I was at a presentation where Jeff Quayle was a guest speaker, and he credits you with being the first trainer to forward the idea that stressing handlers during training will change how their dog performs. Can you explain what you mean by this?
Well, although I appreciate the comment, I certainly wouldn't be the first person to express that for sure. In the dog world, there's a very common phrase that says that the emotions or whatever the handler is feeling runs down the lead to the dog. And people use that common lingo with dog training. And what that really means is that for whatever the reason, and some of it is perception of the dog potentially through things that we don't understand, and other reasons will just be simply through experience and history, through whatever behaviors and experiences the dog has been conditioned to understand that when a handler reacts in a certain way, there is a likelihood of an outcome to that handler's actions. Nonetheless, what we know is that how a handler behaves around a dog certainly affects that dog's performance. And specifically, as we start to try to increase the level of our training output for dogs, we have to, and dog teams, we have to understand that we do need to place stress on the handler so that the dog can learn to work independent of that handler. Far too often we have dogs whose performance is heavily based on the performance of the dog. And we talk about dog teams all the time, and it certainly is a team event. You know, the handler needs the dog and the dog needs the handler. However, we want a dog to be as independent of influence from that handler as possibly can. So when we look at inventions and training aids and tools and apply that to a handler, where we can have the handler be truly concerned about the outcome of an event, so that we can create physiological stress in the handler, which we know that dogs recognize and respond to. So the goal being to put the handler truly in stressful situations, as close as we can, as approximate as we can to what real life will be, and frame those training environments so that the dog can learn to work through those and understand that kind of, you know, I joke about, you know, the dog can look and say, I don't know what's going on with the handler today. He's been like that before, and I just got to do my thing. So we want the dog to learn to work independent and recognize that the handler's stress level should not be an impeding factor for the dog. And I think in some cases, dogs have not seen their handlers or been around their handlers under truly stressful situations until it is a real life situation in an operational context. And I believe sometimes we can see some less than ideal performance out of the dog or the dog team as a result of that. So I do think that it's important to try to put the dog handlers in a stressful situation so that the canines can work through that.
And you touched on some of this, but how is reality-based training different for canine officers versus, you know, doing the reality-based training for regular officers? Are there specific types of scenarios that would help train better?
Well, I think that I think the reality-based training is important for everybody. That being said, we know statistically that the canine teams are going to have a much higher likelihood of being involved in high risk and dangerous situations on any police department, and that's why we have them. So I would surmise from that reality-based training is very, very important for canine teams, for sure. The biggest difference, obviously, and not to sound silly, but the biggest difference is that they have a dog. So now we're dealing with two beings, two animals that we hope are in sync a little bit, but both have their own brains and both can make decisions on their own. So a dog is a semi-autonomous thinking being. It's yes, we train and train and train and train. However, the dog still gets a vote in the matter on the day. They will always have a vote. So we need to try to factor that into our training and make sure that our reality-based training is important and shaped for both the handler and the dog.
I would assume the RBT for canine teams often revolves around criminal apprehension. Are there other areas where RBT is relevant?
Yeah, I think that it's relevant everywhere, and I do agree with your statement that the vast majority of articles you will read and see are really about dog training. There are a lot of focus and articles and books and videos on what in the dog world people would refer to as street transition, civil work, those types of things for dogs. And what they're referring to when they talk about that is teaching a dog to actually bite a human being if they need to. And what we need to remember is that our great-great-great-great-grandparents, they didn't allow dogs to run around the farm biting people. Dogs have always been, for many, many years, a tool that as humans we have used to help us. And when we talk about German Shepherd dogs or Dutch Shepherd dogs, people forget that we are talking about a shepherding dog. So these are dogs that their lineage is about shepherding on behalf of their owners. So many years of bloodlines and breeding have bred these dogs to do certain working traits. And one of them is not necessarily apprehending or biting people. So one of the challenges that we have with dogs is having them transition off of training equipment to the real world, and addressing actually apprehending a criminal suspect if we need to. And I think maybe it's somewhat akin to saying that training in firearms on a square flat range with live ammunition on a paper target does not necessarily prepare an officer to then deal with a lethal force encounter in a small apartment or a crawl space in low light situations where there is a real decision and choice-based training that they have to address. In the same way, training a dog on bite suits and exposed equipment doesn't transition them or teach them to apprehend a real criminal in real life. So there's a lot of articles and training out there in that specific area. And I think that if people were to talk about canine reality-based training, that's exactly where they would go to. And that makes sense, and it's the biggest area. However, that is just training the dog. And I'm not, it is very, very important, and it's a big part of what I do. Mm. But that is not training the team, number one, and it is only training one profile. So reality-based training affects all aspects of training areas, whether they are tracking, building searches, integration to a tactical environment, searching for human remains, doing detection, drug work. If we aren't having dog teams do narcotic searches on vehicles on the side of a highway in the middle of the night with semi-trailers driving by, we are not preparing them to work in the environment that they need to work in. So some of that is just environmental training, but some of it is reality-based training as well, in terms of having scenarios and challenging the handlers and challenging the dog and challenging the team. So reality-based training for canine, I think, tends to focus on that transition off of equipment to apprehending a real human being, a real criminal suspect, and often doesn't go past that. I'm not saying that, I mean, there's certainly many people that are doing that. I'm not casting everybody in that stone, but it is certainly important to make sure that we understand reality-based training affects all profiles and aspects of canine training.
Now, when you're evaluating training, I guess there's the two levels of performance. You have the dog and the handler. Which problems would you say are harder to correct, the ones with the handler or with the dog?
Well, I think that they both present unique challenges for sure. So we have a team of two functioning animals involved that bring their own challenges to the table. On the dog side, one of the challenges that we face in the police community are that our dog trainers are generally police officers that are within that organization. And in many cases, not all, but in many cases, individuals will go into canine for a short period of time, leave, maybe they get another opportunity to go back into canine, or they get to stay as a trainer, depending upon the organization. But those small windows of time do not necessarily give them a large volume of experience in training dogs. So in some cases, the dog training aspect becomes overwhelming in the training percentage of time. So if we look at maybe where if a brand new trainer doesn't have as much experience, and again, I'm not saying that I do, the less experience you have, the more of your training time gets focused on trying to solve dog training issues. And then it can be a challenge with the handler because there's not a lot of time left to that. Another challenge we have in policing is that we often train new dogs and new handlers at the same time. That as well presents some real training challenges for folks, because you have a dog that's just trying to learn a skill, and now you're as well at the same time trying to teach a handler to handle a dog, and sometimes that can be very counterproductive. All in all, because dogs don't speak English and don't talk, probably sometimes they're easier. They don't have emotion, they don't hold grudges, and they're not grouchy in the morning because they had a fight with their significant other the night before. So all in all, probably the dogs are the easier side of it, but we have to be prepared to train both for sure.
Right. Now, if you could pick out the most common error being made by handlers today, what would be the thing that you see the most?
In terms of, again, and I'm not sure that I'm certainly not casting judgment on anything, but I think that one of the challenges is for handlers is not necessarily understanding why. I think that again, that the fable of the monkeys on the ladder, and we just do. Why do we do things around here? That's just the way that we do them. And learning to handle a dog is very, very overwhelming for all of us. When we first start, there was nobody that was just born know how to do this. We were all first-time handlers and first-time students at some point. Everybody was. So we were all there, and it is overwhelming for all of us. But it's important to understand why. And when we understand why in terms of dog training, that helps us problem solve and look to the future. I think the other big challenge operationally that many handlers kind of struggle with when they first start is that we go to a canine program and our worlds can be all about the dog, and we'll start focusing on the dog's performance only, and we get comments like, well, my dog didn't find a track, or our program is about tracking people. Well, there are no operational canine programs whose job operationally is to find a track. A dog team's job operationally is to find a person. And tracking is one of the tools that we use to find a person. But I think sometimes in the initial phases, you can have incredibly talented handlers come in with a lot of experience in looking for criminals and hunting people down, and vast arrays of use of force experience and articulation, and they get a dog, and sometimes we forget about all of that other stuff, and everything becomes just about the dog. And I think we need to remember that the dogs are a tool that help us find people and things, and that's our job, is to find people and stuff. And tracking is one way that we do that, but a huge part of it is that handler's natural ability and that handler's experience and their background, and bringing that together should be enhanced with the presence of a dog. But the dog should not displace all those years of experience that handler has in catching bad guys without a dog. These things should just get better.
Mm-hmm. What are your feelings about the bark and hold techniques? And can you explain that concept to the listeners?
Sure. So I think that it's definitely tends to be a contentious subject in the canine world. In Canada, we see it being a matter of debate and discussion as well. And I think that there's some things that folks don't necessarily understand about it as we go through. So it's fair to say that we have two general sort of employment principles for police canines in North America. One would be bark and hold, guard and bark, and some variants of that. But essentially what that means is that if we were to use a building search as an example, and we had a criminal who had committed a break and enter into a building, all of the use of force variables and authorizations, et cetera, we'll say are in place. So a police dog is sent in offline to search that building. The principle, or the thought principle of bark and hold would be that a dog goes in, will locate that suspect, and if the suspect is hiding or remaining motionless, then the dog will not take hold of that suspect, but will sit in front of the suspect and bark until the police can locate them. If the suspect were to assault the dog, and generally the terminology is a furtive motion or movement, then the dog then may take hold of that suspect by biting them generally in one of their limbs and ideally taking hold and not releasing until the police were able to locate them. So that would be bark and hold, or guard and bark, or some variation of that.
Okay.
A handler control dog example would be if we use the exact same scenario, when that dog is sent into the premise or into the warehouse, when they locate that suspect, they will, and if they are able to, they will take hold of that suspect immediately. If they're not able to do that, for example, if the suspect is high or hidden behind a doorway, the dog will then provide some sort of indication, typically barking, that they've located the suspect. So the debate, of course, is then about, well, bark and hold will reduce what people will speak to as a bite ratio, or the number of contacts made with suspects. And there's a few things that are incorrect in that assumption. Number one, historically, and certainly from one of my very important mentors, Dave Reber, who I've spent a lot of time with in this area and in discussions and training with, when we look historically at a guarding behavior, a guarding behavior was never intended to stop a dog from apprehending somebody. It was intended to as a test of a dog, actually, to increase their willingness to engage and be in combative behavior with a human being. The bigger issue is that if we use that or consider that warehouse example, when the dog goes into the warehouse, the use of force decision at that time is being made by a dog and not by a human being. So if we are deploying a dog on a regular basis with the assumption that the dog will not apprehend somebody unless there is a furtive movement, which generally is a very unreliable output and an unreliable expectation of a dog operationally. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, even if we assume that the dog will do that on a very reliable basis, which I would not make that assumption, we have put a use of force decision into the dog's brain, vice understanding that we need to have our use of force justification. The scenario, the situation needs to support the use of a dog. And when we see agencies that or organizations that are really promoting the use of a guard and bark dog, in many cases the justification is not done on a solid understanding of the facts of the way dogs really work and of true statistical information. And it certainly tends to, we hear a lot about it in the dog world. And I think people just need to really be informed before they make a decision of a policy, one way or the other, of what it is that they're truly getting. And when we look at the the overview and the criticism and of police use of force in general, I'm not sure that we can defend putting a use of force decision in the brain of a dog.
Right. And some agencies list their canine on the use of force continuum as a weapon. Others do not. What approach would you think is the best going forward? Would you say, the dog bite is a weapon?
Well, I don't. Everybody has reasons for why they do what they do, but and I'm not here to. I'm certainly not going to be critical of what other agencies do. I will just say that I have heard conversations and people that do not view their police dogs as a use of force option will make comparisons or analogy to a flashlight, for example, saying that a dog is a search tool who may also make contact with a suspect. Just like a flashlight is used to search for people in exigent circumstances or some sort of spontaneous event, there is a chance that flashlight would end up being used as an intermediate force option. The difference being with dogs that we purchase dogs that are selectively bred to try to increase the likelihood that they will be prepared to apprehend a suspect if they need to, and we participate and set up a significant amount of training time to help develop the dog's ability to apprehend a suspect if they need to. So to treat a dog only like a search tool and not as well as a use of force option, to me, I can't justify that in my head. So I do believe that the use of a police canine is a justifiable and defendable use of force option for policing.
How do consensus-based or best practices affect canine training?
Well, I think that in some cases it can be negative, and I look over the years, and we talked about earlier about anything that I know, however little that is. I've learned through making many mistakes, and consensus-based decisions or policies are not necessarily evidence-based, and best practices just means in many cases that a whole bunch of people will agree to do it. And I've had the opportunity over the last number of years to participate in some projects that were driven through evidence and were hopefully mostly evidence-based programs. And that's helped me really look back and as they say, learn more, know less, and realize a number of the mistakes that I've made in the past. And I'll give you one example, and I use it because I've tried to learn from it, and a mistake that I was involved with as we roll forward with my own training. And that was an example of a canine drop drill. So again, another mentor and influence. My first boss was Cliff Sampson in the canine world, had the idea of drop drills where we would work on the handler dropping the leash in the event of a spontaneous lethal threat, drawing their weapon and being able to defend themselves. And I took that idea and rolled that into a number of multiple drills where we would work through a sequence of dropping a leash, drawing, moving to cover, and train that as much as I could, and thought, this makes sense. And then when I would run that by or discuss that with other handlers across the country, they would as well say, hey, this makes sense. This is a good idea. We should do that. And as a result, I could surmise from that we had, everyone would agree, this is a good idea, which then makes it a best practice. And and everybody agreed that it was a good idea. So it was consensus based. And when you take a look at that, I go, well, okay, that's consensus based, but it's certainly not evidence based. And so Jeff Quayle, who's been a strong influence on me and certainly a mentor for me in many areas, specifically highly in the reality-based area, when he started developing with his team on the spontaneous knife defense work and that type of stuff, and saying, we'll come up with the techniques after we have some evidence on what our physiology is going to drive us to do. And so I looked at that and then realized how foolish my mistake was. I was training something that I had no idea if physiologically a handler under stress could in fact let go of a leash. So we were training a drill in a static and maybe a fluid training situation or environment at best. It certainly wasn't dynamic, and there certainly was no spontaneous threat or a high level of stress involved. And training a drill that the reality is we don't even know if the human brain would allow a handler to do that in real life under an elevated stress level.
So you're saying when you tested the scenario with reality-based training, the officer wouldn't always drop the leash like you thought?
Yeah. Again, when we talked earlier a little bit of how we have a culture where it's a craft, etc., and we just accept sort of these theories, and in particular where we're dealing with dogs who don't speak English, we actually really have no idea. I mean, everything is a guess with a dog because nobody speaks dog and dogs don't speak English. So at best, it's a guess, really. We still don't know with 100% certainty with anything. There's a lot of areas where we have adopted things in the canine world that are consensus-based or best practices, but there maybe was really not a lot of evidence in the front end. And I know for myself personally, I now try to, having learned from mentors and coaches and trying to get better at this, I now do try to ensure that we go with evidence first, and then let's worry about our TTPs or our techniques and drills after we find out what the human caveman brain is going to make somebody do in a real life stressful situation, as opposed to in the past where I know I've certainly made some errors in reverse engineering my approaches. I think that ideas are great. Everything's generated through an idea, through those discussions. But before it becomes, the consensus that it's a good idea that we need to know what to do in this situation is great. But we need to add an evidence piece in there to the best that we can do, at least before we start making drills that we don't even know if we're able to do. Particularly in policing, where training time is limited, and we have to. We would be very limited in our resources in training with the ability to try to out-train physiology and try to reprogram that to get the number of reps required. In some cases, is maybe a bridge too far.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense with the limited training budgets and things like that to make sure that the drills you're running are actually useful in the end. For a police dog, is having an aggressive dog important?
I think that again, definitions are what they are. We talk about aggression training, and when I started in Canine, it was we used that terminology of aggression training, and I'm not sure that it really is aggression. And again, I guess we could debate. Everyone's going to have their own definition of things, but we're looking really for a dog that is going to apprehend a suspect. But in many cases, aggression, I think for some folks, it implies malice or emotion. And I think it's a better way of thinking that we want a dog who's prepared to spar with a human being and who's prepared to go take and apprehend a human being if they're tasked to. But it should not be about necessarily aggression or that they have emotion tied into it or any of those things. And I think sometimes when we think of an elevated level of aggression, at least in my brain, then we think of boxers or fighters who then start to fade into the black. So when we see professional fighters who remain calm and are sparring and are managing the situation that they are in, although very incredibly serious and very talented people who are absolutely causing physical pain and injury to each other, as long as they are calm and sparring and not getting hectic and going into the black, they tend to do well. Once people go into the black, things don't go so well. And I think sometimes the terminology aggression refers to that, where it's really about the dogs having emotion involved in what they're doing and really trying to hurt somebody or being in the black. And when we look at it that way, that is not what I want. I'm looking for a dog who will be clear-headed, stable, and handle a situation. And if a criminal apprehension is required, they're able to do that. And for the dog, it is just a matter, this is what I do. I'm going to chase this person down and catch them and hold on to them until we apprehend them, and we'll adjust accordingly based on the fight or the resistance offered by that suspect. But it doesn't necessarily require aggression when we think of aggression involving emotion.
Right. Now, how does having a police dog affect the officer's use of their other subject-controlled tools?
Well, it should have no effect in the perfect world. But I think when we talked about training time and budgets, and when we're talking across North America, we have dog handler courses that range from 2 weeks to 5 months. And in many cases, if somebody finishes dog handler school and they go onto the road and they are not able to draw their gun and defend themselves with lethal force if required while they have their dog with them, if they're not able to use other intermediate force options while they're employing their dog, they're certainly at a great limitation and handicap. I don't think any handler, if you ask them to be a dog handler, said, okay, you can be a dog handler, but you have to give up all of your other use of force options. No one would sign up for that. Yet, certainly there's a number of handlers that have been put onto the road where they're not able to even access those tools because the performance of the dog isn't at as reliable stage where it is. So, and again, I'm not saying that we haven't figured out either, but it certainly needs to be something that we need to remember and always be striving for, that a dog is but one tool, and it should not preclude all of our other options, and we need to be able to escalate and de-escalate as required and move through the continuum, with the dog being part of that solution and not a problem. Having a dog with a handler should be part of the solution and not a liability.
Right. And so we're just on our last a question here, finishing up this interview. And is there any other areas? I know you've mentioned a few things throughout our talk, but are there canine programs, in canine programs, are there maybe a few fundamental changes that could make a big impact on training programs that you've noticed, or just any other comments you want to make about canine training for law enforcement or military in general?
I think, and I know I've said it a few times, but I'm certainly, I don't have it all figured out at all, and I want to be crystal clear that I am just a knuckle dragger trying to figure this stuff out as well. But if there was advice that I would to provide, and I don't know that I'm in that position to provide advice, is a couple things. The first one would be always remembering that operations drive training, and we need to remember what the end state is, And those repetitions that we put our dog teams through are going to roll out onto the street. So if, for example, a common thing in dog training is we send a dog when we're working on apprehensions, we send the dog and then the handler runs down the field after the dog and praises the dog and is focusing on the dog training side of that. Well, we have to be careful how much of that we do in training, because we can certainly, when we look at primacy of learning, and we know that what we learn first, we learn best generally, and we have to be careful under stress that those things won't get duplicated on the street. When we send a dog and now we have handlers running and chasing their dog behind them, it can cause them some grief. I think that it's very important to ensure that with training programs, we break training down into training the dog, training the handler, and training the canine team. And because the dog piece can be so overwhelming, we can spend the vast majority of time training dogs and just doing dog training. Well, while we're doing dog training, we aren't doing handler training generally, and in some cases we are doing team training. So if we're doing unknown tracking with a dog, that is a team training event for sure, but it's not necessarily just training the handler. So that pre-operation, post-operation, for example, the articulation of what happened would then just be training the handler. The vast majority of time we're just training the dog. Choice-based decisions in reality-based training, having the handler articulate a lot of things as they go through, understanding escalation, de-escalation, understanding the environment, all of those things. We need to make sure that we are running scenario-based, reality-based training where it's as realistic as we possibly can, ensuring that dogs can function with a muzzle on so that we can present pictures to the dog as they are going to appear for the dog and the dog handler, that dog team in real life. If we have dogs that are dependent upon the use of equipment, then it is akin to doing a general patrol scenario where the bad guy has a sim suit on and nobody else does, and thinking that the person is really making a decision whether they should use lethal force or not on the one individual who is covered in red paint and has a sim mask on. There's probably some cueing and signaling going on there, and that same thing can happen in the dog world. So we really need to make sure, and myself included, we all get wrapped up into the dog side of it, and we have to make sure we're training the handler as well as training the team. And I mean, lastly, I would just say always stay, humble and curious, and never accept things just because. Always asking for why. I think in the dog training world, they say that the only thing that two dog trainers will ever agree on is what the third dog trainer is doing wrong. And in many cases, we talk about this is the way to do something. And I start most conversations or classes saying that what I understand that I'm teaching now, I know that it is wrong. I know that we used to think that the world was flat. Used to be able to smoke on a plane, and doctors used to say cigarettes were okay. And we know that that's wrong. And I know that what I'm teaching right now is probably wrong. It's just the best that I know with the information that I have at this time. And because I take that approach, when I gain new information, it's not hard for me to change it, because I never said I was right in the first place. I knew that I was wrong, and I was hopeful that I would get more information that allowed me to then change. And I think that that's sometimes in the dog world, we get stuck in that where people say this is the way to do things, and then it becomes hard to change. It becomes hard to improve because you were quoted as saying this is the way to do something. And if we just recognize that we have to be, if we are not looking back I look back now at training I did 10 years ago and go, wow, I can't believe I taught that. That's crazy. But at the time, it's what I know. And I know that this interview, in a number of years, I'll look back and go, man, you really had no idea what you were talking about. And that's okay. That's what should happen. In time, we should go back and go, wow, I really learned a lot in the next 5 years. I'm looking forward to what I'm going to learn in the next 5 years to teach myself what is actually what I think is right now is probably wrong. So I think that's really important for folks. And if you take that approach on it, then it's easy to change, it's easy to adapt, and it's easy to try to improve as you go forward. And our job as dog trainers is to get better so that we can do a better job of putting our handlers out on the road into dangerous situations as safely and as best prepared as we can make them for the situations, the very bad situations that they're going to have to face.
That sounds like a really good mantra to have, in canine training, but also in many things in life, to have an open mind to learn. Some things you learned could be wrong, and it's been a really interesting aspect of policing to learn about. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, Brad Gillespie, and good luck in the future.
Well, thank you very much for your time, and again, thanks very much for chatting with me. I really appreciate it.
This has been the Prepared Warrior Podcast. For more info on our guests or other episodes, check out thepreparedwarrior.com. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for the Prepared Warrior Podcast, email jon@thepreparedwarrior.com.